Welcome to Sabby Podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is Senator Jamie Eldridge. He is a senator here in Massachusetts, and he is here to discuss two pieces of legislation. One of them is public banking, and the other one is Medicare for all. Jamie, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, Sabrina, thanks for having me on. Great to be on the podcast, and yeah, very happy to talk about these bills, which I think are very interconnected in terms of economic and racial inequality and trying to combat that. So great to be on.
Awesome. So before we get into these two pieces of legislation, I want to start with the public banking bill. We've been talking about public banks on this show for quite a while. The interest came about from a friend of the show, Roger Meadows. He was the one that kind of educated me about public banks, particularly about the Public Bank of North Dakota. But I'm curious, why do you feel this particular issue is incredibly important?
Yeah, well, the involvement in how I got to filing this public bank bill, which I will say this is just the second session it's been filed. So it really was an idea for many years. Now about 10 years ago, I co-chaired what was called the Asset Development Commission, which revealed that the vast majority of Massachusetts residents were really just a month's paycheck loss away from not being able to pay for rent, for food, for other costs. That most Massachusetts residents, again, a state that's among the wealthiest in the country, are quite asset poor, didn't have savings, often don't have equity because they don't own a home. And the other piece, which was a 2006 report from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston called The Color of Wealth, which focused on the fact that in Boston, it was a focus on Boston residents, that the average wealth or equity for a white family was about $230,000, mostly tied to them owning a home. Black home ownership was literally $8 in the savings, and Latino savings was about the same. And so just a vast disparity in equity. And part of that, of course, is that poor communities tend to be either unbanked or underbanked. So you don't have banks that are willing to reach out to those communities because they're not going to make a profit. And if our community banks or our big banks are not doing that, then there's a place for the state to be involved. And so that was really the idea, is coming from an equity point of view, economic inequality, racial inequality, including around wealth. And the reality is a lot of people gain that equity by being able to buy a house, by starting a business, or just being in a community that isn't seeing the kind of investment that's needed, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's climate or infrastructure projects, and a public bank could play a role where the traditional or private banks are not interested in and are not playing a role right now.
That's right. And the study that Jamie is referring to, the Boston Globe were the ones that did that study where they found out about the net worth gap of Bostonians. And I think that's incredibly important for people to understand. Although there are a lot of wealthy people in Massachusetts, there is a huge gap when it comes to net worth. So I think that's important for people to understand. And the second piece of legislation that you have is the Medicare for all bill. Can you explain to everyone why you feel this is important?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think so many people have come to the cause of making healthcare right, which I want to be clear, of course, does not exist in America, but also does not exist in Massachusetts. I think because Massachusetts, to its credit, was a leader around comprehensive health insurance coverage, that sometimes some of my colleagues, other public policy folks say, oh, healthcare is a right in Massachusetts. But, we have about the same percentage of people that, go into bankruptcy because of medical debt. We have the same complaints from the public about, co-pays, deductibles, and a disparity of care. So I personally got involved with this because when I first started as a state senator, I actually unfortunately suffered a seizure, and so I was in the hospital, geez, for about 6 weeks, probably about 2 or 3 months of rehab outside of being released. And I had probably ten to $20,000 in bills, and I have probably among the best health insurance in the state, being a public employee. So if that's what I faced, imagine someone that has a poor or bad health insurance plan, or lives in an area where you don't have access to great health care. So that really became a passion of mine, and I really championed the cause and was fortunate a couple years later to become the lead Senate sponsor of an act to establish Medicare for all in Massachusetts. So I've filed the bill now for, about 10 years, and we're trying to build up the movement. I would say that Senator Bernie Sanders' 2 campaigns for president really lifted up the issue. I think
Yeah.
people now know what Medicare for all is. However, the path to get there, both nationally and at the state level, remains very difficult. But still in the fight, and still looking to pass the legislation and make healthcare right in Massachusetts.
Right. And I want people to understand, because I think some people, they've reached out to me about this question before. And I just want people to know that, yes, we do have Mass Health in Massachusetts, but that's not Medicare for all. In fact, Mass Health, it is income. There's like income requirements with that. So it's means tested. So I want people to understand there is no Medicare for all program in Massachusetts, because I've gotten that question a couple times before. And I think people just, I'm not sure why they think that, but I've heard people ask that question before, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah, and Sabrina, I think what I would say about Mass Health is that Mass Health is a form of single payer. You're right; it's means tested, so obviously you're not eligible unless you're under a certain income. And I guess where I would make sort of the point about why we need to move to healthcare being a right is that you have people that have a job, and then they get laid off, so they lose their health insurance, because health insurance is generally tied to employment in this country. And then they're applying to Mass Health. There's lots of bureaucratic delays because it's not funded well enough. There's a lot of paperwork involved. Often they call legislators for support. What an incredibly inefficient system, where if you took Medicare, generally seen as very comprehensive, universal coverage, and expanding that to all Massachusetts residents, separating healthcare or health insurance from your employment, so that whatever happens in your life, whether you get laid off, whether you're a college student, whether you're someone that has unique healthcare challenges, the government is directly paying for those bills, and most importantly, doctors can provide the care they think is necessary for you as a patient. So that's the vision, and Mass Health is a form of single payer, but imagine if it was expanded so that everybody was covered under Medicare for all in Massachusetts.
That's right. So let's dive into the public banking bill. So it says here, an act to establish a Massachusetts public bank, and it says like, what would it do? So I want to dive into this piece here and make this a little bit larger. Establishing a public bank wholly owned by the Commonwealth requires the public bank to use its resources to fill pressing and unmet capital gaps in underserved communities, women and minority-owned small businesses and farms, municipalities experiencing underinvestment, housing and worker co-ops. And I'm one of those people who's really passionate about worker co-ops.
Me too. Yep.
And community scale climate investments. Can we talk a little bit about this?
Sure. All of those things, or?
Yes.
Okay. Absolutely. Well, I think that list is a pretty solid list of where there's gaps for loans, for grants, for where the state and federal government is not providing support. So you look at, underserved communities, and, I mentioned earlier that Federal Reserve Bank of Boston report around called The Color of Wealth, is that, part of that is that, unfortunately, when you go into a lot of low-income communities, disproportionately, often, people of color, say in Boston, is that there's no banks. There's no Bank of America. There's no community banks. because there's been a decision at the top of the ranks that it's not profitable. It's not a good place to have a bank. And so that means that people that, are saving their money, that, want to buy a house, whether in the community or somewhere else, they want to start a business, just automatically have that barrier to getting access to capital. So underserved communities is a really big challenge around banking and loans and grants. The same, goes for women and minority-owned small businesses. Study after study shows that, people that have the same business plan, the same, investments, savings, ideas around starting a business, that there continues to be massive discrimination in the private banking community as far as who gets those loans and who doesn't, excuse me. So a public bank would address that. Municipalities experiencing underinvestment. I have a number of small rural communities that, want to take action around housing, around transportation investments, but, often the state dollars, the federal dollars don't reach them. And a public bank could provide the funding for a project, whether it's, improved bus service, whether it's, a rail trail, whether it's addressing transportation gaps that will really expand the opportunities for those communities. Housing and working cooperatives. Sabrina, I'm so glad to hear you're so passionate about that. I've really seen the benefit of housing co-ops in my district. My district has a number of mobile home parks where the tenants were really an afterthought by the property owner. Not good upkeep, raising the rent pretty regularly, unsafe conditions. And so I've now helped about 3 mobile home parks come together, tenants coming together, and with the help of a cooperative, actually purchasing the park from the owner. And now they get to decide. They're in charge about what the rent is, what the upkeep is, about the conditions, and probably most importantly for them, they get to remain in their homes and not be bought out by a venture capitalist. So so the idea is that with a public bank, it could provide this capital up front. And I want to be clear, this isn't about, grants. These are loans, but the money isn't being put forward by the private banks. And so a public bank could provide that money up front and have it be paid back to create more cooperatives in a state where we're facing a massive housing and affordable housing crisis. And then on community scale climate investments, we don't have a dedicated revenue source in Massachusetts for climate projects. That could be electrifying, more homes, more businesses, schools. It could be addressing the concerns around floods or heat waves, which are increasing. And yet, right now, despite some new state grants, a lot of them don't go all the way to build these climate projects. And so climate projects would be eligible under this public bank. So again, you see a lot of gaps, and I think that this bill would fill a lot of those gaps for people across Massachusetts.
That's right. And I want to add something about the banks. It's really important that people understand. So if I were to go to Roxbury, for example, you may have a difficult time finding a bank in Roxbury. So then those residents would have to go to another Boston neighborhood that does have a bank to try to get a loan. But then that is connected back to that study that came from the Boston Globe about net worth, because if you don't have any collateral, then the banks don't really want to give you a loan. So all of this is connected, is what I want people to understand. And then this portion here establishes that the public bank will support rather than compete with private banks. And that piece, I think, is really important, because some people assume, well, if we have a public bank, isn't that going to compete with like Bank of America? No, Bank of America will be just fine.
Bank of America will be just fine, record profits year after year. And again, let's remember the reason there's this gap, right, is because the big banks, or even a lot of the community banks, they're not interested to provide, loans for the projects that I just talked about. So it's not in competition with them. Would love to see those, banks be more proactive for these more sort of community minded projects. but they're not interested in them. They're making record profits right now. Why not establish a public bank to establish this equity, the greater opportunity for residents across Massachusetts, and for a lot of cities and towns that want to do the right thing on climate, on housing, on transportation infrastructure, but right now are unable to get state grants or federal funding to do that.
That's right. And subjects the public bank to prudential supervision by the MA Division of Banks, such that the public bank will comply with the same rules applying to private banks chartered in the Commonwealth. That's another question that I've received from people too. Are they going to have the same rules? And I think it's important for people to understand, like, there's so many things that you can do if you have a public bank. Like, I talked to someone from North Dakota not too long ago, and she explained to me, like, this is why they've been able to pass a lot of legislation in North Dakota, is because they don't have to ask, okay, where's the money going to come from for these initiatives? They don't have to ask that question because they have the Bank of North Dakota, which is a public bank. So this could actually help states a lot. I think more states should put forth this type of legislation, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, North Dakota was established during the, 1910s, 1920s progressive era, actually led by a lot of farmers. That created, municipal power plants, this state bank, a lot of cooperatives. And so I think with the increasing inequality in America, which, by the way, has significantly intensified as a result of the pandemic, wealthy people got wealthier. The rest of us, lost equity. The incomes did not go up. A lot of other costs did go up. So it really is a key piece to combating inequality in America and, of course, in Massachusetts. And again, for those who are following the podcast from outside of Massachusetts, Massachusetts, strong social safety net, generally in a better state than many other states economically. And yet the inequality gap is one of the biggest in the country. It's in the top 10. So you have a growing group of wealthy individuals, but the working class, those who are less well off, and even many people in the middle class are seeing their earnings going down, their buying power going down. And again, no one proposal is a solution or a panacea to all this, but I do think a public bank would be a significant sort of option to combat inequality throughout Massachusetts.
I agree. And here's a good question here from Jessica. I'm not familiar with public banks. How can you tell if a bank is public? Only a few states have them. The only one I know of is the Bank of North Dakota, but that's a good question.
Right. If you're in North Dakota, then you have a public bank. If you're in another state, you don't. There are some, there's in Massachusetts, for example, there's quasi-public agencies that provide, some loans. There's something called the Mass Capital Growth Corporation, which does provide small loans. Some chambers of commerce do micro lending, but the reality is that they tend to benefit overwhelmingly middle class, upper middle class individuals or businesses. So it's very hard for working class people, for a lot of immigrants, for those who are less well off, who have a great idea, or a city or town that's not very wealthy but can't get access to this capital, and really a lot of gaps there. So yeah, there's no other public bank aside from North Dakota. We'd love Massachusetts to be number 2, and it's really been a really impressive grassroots coalition over the past 4 years that's put this together, and we're excited for this session.
And the other piece here is provides funding for the public bank's $1.6 billion in assets by appropriating $200 million in capital equity over a period of 4 years. So that's $50 million each, and requiring the state treasurer, to hold deposits at an annual average of $1.4 billion in the public bank. The amount will be transferred from balances currently held at the Massachusetts Municipal Depository Trust, with no impact on Massachusetts private banks. So again, for those wondering, this would not have an impact on the private banks. I think that's important.
Absolutely. And I think I appreciate you citing that, because I think it's also important to remember what that means is that a lot of our state reserves are in the big banks. A lot of them are in the Bank of America. A lot of them are in large banks that, to be honest, aren't really creating that many jobs in Massachusetts, aren't really providing many benefits to many Massachusetts residents. Why not take that money and put it into our public bank system where the dollars are going to stay local? And we know that there's more of a public mission than the big banks, including a bank like Bank of America is right now.
100%. Yesterday, I recorded an interview. We're moving on to the Medicare for All piece with Mass Care. So it's the organization here. I know you know who they are, but for people watching, organization here in Massachusetts, and these volunteers have been trying to get some type of single payer established here in Massachusetts. And this goes hand in hand with Jamie's bill, the Medicare for All bill. And one of the things they mentioned to me yesterday, because I was asking them, like, have you spoken to these politicians? Have you done videos? I think video testimonials are incredibly powerful if you can get people who have had like bad experiences in reference to medical debt. And you would need a lot of people, not just like one or two people. So we were talking about like strategy, things that can go around that. And what they made pretty clear to me yesterday is that it seems like there are two people in particular. I know Cindy Friedman is one of them. And it seems like they are gatekeepers in a way that even if other politicians may agree with it, it seems like if you can't convince those two people, her, and I forget the other person's name, but I think it's one in the House and one in the Senate. But it seems like if you can't change their mind, then this is why the legislation is not being brought to the floor for a vote. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I would respectfully push back on that a bit, because I think the thing is that I think sometimes in the Medicare for All movement, there's a quick assumption that it's just a couple of key policymakers that are the reason that we're not making progress on making healthcare right. And I don't think it really is. I think it's really convincing a majority of legislators, as well as the governor, our new governor, Maura Healey, to get behind making healthcare right. Senator Friedman, who is the just recently reappointed Senate chair of the Healthcare Finance Committee, she's done a tremendous job to find different ways to expand healthcare under our current system. I think the point that Mass Care and myself and others make is that the system itself is broken. If you're just working around the edges, you're not going to address the massive healthcare costs for Massachusetts. You're not going to address the co-pays, deductibles, and premiums that are really crushing on families' budgets. And so the challenge is that to get more legislators to really advocate for making healthcare right, to pass single payer, that can be forums, that can be, as you said, Sabrina, people telling their stories, including all the terrible stories from the pandemic. You talk about a broken public health system. You talk about people that have long COVID or long-term COVID that have these incredibly expensive bills right now. And obviously in Massachusetts, the tens of thousands of deaths of people from COVID, some of which I do believe could have been prevented, under a Medicare for All system, a more responsive system. So I think it is, it's not just any particular individual legislator. It's really about, getting more legislators to be strong supporters, not just to say that they co-sponsor the bill, but that they're going to do a forum in their district. They're going to fight for making healthcare right. And, by the way, what are the things we can do this session to move towards that healthcare as a right model, even if we're not able to pass the full bill?
Well said. So I want to show everyone a part of the bill here. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think it logged me out, but Eric, I have to log back in to type in and see. What I noticed yesterday also with Mass Care when I was speaking to them was that they also informed me that this would actually save the state at least approximately $34 billion if we had a Medicare for All system here in Massachusetts. So this would actually save the state money for those watching. And so for me, I'm watching the news, the local news, and I'm seeing the reporters are saying that people are fleeing Massachusetts ever since the start of the pandemic because of the cost of living, and some of the small businesses have closed as well. In fact, a lot of the small businesses have closed permanently because they were shut down during the pandemic and couldn't recoup the money there. But this is another thing to push, is that we have people leaving the state because it's expensive to live here. And then on top of that, people have medical debt because they either are underinsured, they're not insured, or just because the cost of healthcare is extremely expensive. And this would save the state money. So you would think something like this, like I'm thinking, if Massachusetts was first, and we don't have to be first, but we've done a lot of firsts in the state, because we were the first to legalize gay marriage. We were the first to legalize cannabis. Like Obamacare came from technically Massachusetts. It was Romneycare.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Imagine if we were the first ones to implement Medicare for all, and everyone can go back to and say, well, it came from Massachusetts.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And the savings are spot on because, you know, Massachusetts, again, has arguably the best healthcare in the world for those that can afford to pay it, and most of us can't. And that's a distinction. But it's also the most expensive healthcare in the world. So we're the most expensive in the country, and the U.S. spends the most dollars per capita, with arguably some of the worst outcomes for a developed country. We have the lowest mortality rate for a developed country, the highest infant mortality rate, and we have a record number of bankruptcies through medical debt. So the savings, of course, because people say, well, where are the savings? The savings are from, think about all of the paperwork. When any one of us goes to the doctor, all the paperwork that, the person behind the scenes at the medical clinic or the medical center or practice is filling out, to get approval or to get a bill paid by the health insurance company. You think about all of the ways that, often sort of high-end hospitals or practices focus on areas of healthcare that really aren't that needed in the state. Another MRI machine, another, CAT scan, even, get into things like plastic surgery that really are delivering, healthcare improvements. But because those things pay better, that's where the money is being invested versus pediatricians in every community in Massachusetts, public health experts, and our community hospitals, which, by the way, are closing, are shutting down their psych wards. They're, at risk of financial calamity. So it's really reached a crisis. And again, just sort of nibbling around at the edges, just sort of saying we're going to have some modest expansions around, health insurance coverage is not going to address the costs or the care for millions of residents across Massachusetts.
That's right. And one of the things it says here, benefits of a Medicare for all system, a single payer system would save about 29% of our current spending on healthcare, take the burden of rising healthcare costs off of most small businesses, municipalities, and families, eliminate medical debt and medical bankruptcy, and guarantee access to quality, affordable health care as a right for all residents of the Commonwealth. And what I like here is that you even have the roadmap to transition, because this is another piece where sometimes people will present bills, but they don't tell you how to get there. Like they say, this is what we want, but they don't tell you how to get it. And it says the 29-member board trustees, including but not limited to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of Administration and Finance, the Commissioner of Public Health, and 2 single-payer advocates will be tasked with establishing clear processes to transition to Medicare for all. So let's talk about that for a second, because Blue Cross Blue Shield, they're huge here.
Yep.
One of the questions that came up for, at least for Bernie Sanders, was what happens to all of the employees that work for healthcare companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield or Aetna? How would that transition work?
Yeah, so part of our bill would establish a trust for money to go into to retrain people. And, first of all, if you want to talk to someone who generally is unhappy with their job, talk to someone who's processing insurance claims, often denying, health insurance claims from patients. So it's not, it's one of those jobs that, again, it's not, respectfully, producing a lot, contributing a lot to society. Imagine if that person was able to go back and get retrained in nursing school, become a doctor, become a public health expert, a nutritionist, and actually contribute to improving people's healthcare outcomes versus finding different ways to deny coverage. So the bill does have a trust fund that would retrain workers. Those that sort of raise this issue, which I think sometimes can be a bit of a straw man argument, because what I hear from each and every day about the need to make government more efficient, the need to make different systems more efficient. Well, our healthcare system is arguably the most inefficient system. You talk about health insurance companies, third party providers, all of the administration in a hospital or medical center. And a lot of that could be eliminated, which I think is, a good thing, create an efficient system, and then train those, people to be more, productive. Look, Massachusetts electrified its turnpike system, the toll system.
Yep.
There are no more toll collectors. I think, most people would agree that, toll collectors weren't really necessary. And now you have a better system, and the individuals that were toll collectors were retrained to find other jobs. In a similar vein, I think that needs to happen in our healthcare system, and it's going to create better jobs that are more satisfying for people across the state.
So one question I have, this leads into ballot initiatives, because this is something where we looked at these two bills and we were wondering, like, could we try to put forth a ballot measure for either one of these bills? We did have a meeting with you, but for those who are watching in the audience, can you please explain to everyone the cost? Because I think this is the factor that a lot of people may not consider. How much do you estimate that it would cost us to try to run a ballot initiative for, like, public bank, for example?
Yeah, and I think Massachusetts we're blessed to be in a state with a referendum process that that voters, that citizens can collect signatures to bring something to the ballot, so people can vote on it. And we actually recently passed a millionaire's tax to increase the tax on those who earn over $1 million a year. And it's going to create about $1 billion a year for transportation and education investments. Just that campaign, both sides, including, wealthy individuals, corporations, spent tens of millions of dollars. And so I think the thing that's important to realize about, the public bank bill is that, unfortunately, still the Mass Bankers Association, the trade group that represents pretty much all banks, has expressed its opposition to the public bank bill. Even though I do not think it's competition, they see it as competition. They see it as a precedent. And the fear is that if we went to the ballot, that banks, again, not just in Massachusetts, but, you think about a Bank of America or, Santander or other banks, they would likely pour millions of dollars in Massachusetts to, unfortunately, do misleading campaigns and perhaps scare voters to voting against this referendum. And so, unfortunately, and we saw this with the millionaire's tax, is that if you're going to put forth a referendum on a progressive policy, whether it's making healthcare right, whether it's public bank, whether it's taxing the rich, is that you've got to have, often through labor unions, often through progressive groups, you've got to have the revenue to get out your message to win the day. And just to put sort of a fine point on that, the millionaire's tax, which was polling about 2-1, most people actually agree that wealthy people don't pay enough in taxes. But on the final vote in November, it passed just by about 5 percentage points. So something that had a lot of support, good populist policy, just barely passed in Massachusetts. So I think, I know we had that meeting. It's important to talk about the realities of a referendum, about the public bank, about Medicare for all, or other progressive policies, and the corporate interests that would oppose it in the millions of dollars they would likely spend.
Yeah. So for people who are not in a BI state, for example, with the dental insurance question that came out, what they'll do is they'll send flyers to us in the mail. One will say, vote yes on question 1. The other one will say, reasons why you need to vote no on question 1. And what I think is important to pay attention to when you receive those is who is actually supporting it and who's opposed to it. So for the dental insurance question, that flyer that went out that said to vote no, if you looked at the list of supporters, it was all the insurance companies. So, so of course they don't want you to vote for that. But that's really important and that's key. And they will run those campaigns. Like I saw those ads like nonstop. Don't vote for it. Don't do it. I saw the same thing with right to repair. Same thing with legalizing marijuana, although that still did pass. And the millionaire tax one, I believe that was the second time this was ran as a ballot measure, if I'm not mistaken. I think they ran it before, but it didn't pass.
It's actually, Sabrina, it was the 5th time in the past 40 years that it was on the ballot. So it was defeated 4 previous times. So it finally passed this time. And just a point of pride on that, you noted on the mailers, the disclosures, that was a bill that I got passed, 10 years ago after the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, just to say that if corporations are going to spend money on mailings on TV, that they had to disclose the source of that money in every ad or mailing. So that's because of a bill we passed, the Disclose Act, but it doesn't stop the money from flowing, and it will flow in here from across the country, I think, on a public bank or Medicare for all. So we have to get, ideally passage through the legislature, or if we're going to go to the ballot, we really have to have a plan to raise the money to get out our message.
Right. So we would need like a grassroots coalition, like a strong grassroots movement. I interviewed activists before from Washington State. They were trying to do the same thing there. They're called Whole Washington, and they have another group that worked with them called the Red Berets. And they were actually collecting the signatures to try to get, I think in Washington State, it's a ridiculous number of amount of signatures that they needed for that. But they didn't end up reaching that goal by December. Now, part of that was the pandemic hurt them with that because it has to be a wet signature. And they couldn't go around door to door to get as many if they would have been if it wasn't for the pandemic. But they've been in this fight, and they know, how hard it can be and what it takes to at least even get it on the ballot. Like that,
right.
That's the tough part. And then there's the wording that I think people can be tripped up by. I go back to 2020 and we had the question about ranked choice voting, which to me, I thought was a no-brainer. But after talking to people, a lot of people just didn't understand the question, so they voted against it.
Right. They got confused. When people get confused, they tend to vote no. Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. 100%.
Absolutely. And I will say last year I was very involved with the driver's license law for undocumented immigrants, which the legislature actually passed. But then conservative activists got it on the ballot to repeal it. But what was confusing about the messaging was that to keep the law was yes, and to repeal it was no. And we had to raise money to get out that message too, because I think initially a lot of people that supported the driver's license law thought, oh, well, I'm going to vote no because I want to oppose the repeal. But again, to your point, Sabrina, the message, the wording of the ballot was, do you reaffirm the legislature passing this law? So we had to get the word out. That did pass, but that was also pretty close.
Yes. When we went through the ballot measures, because we've done them for every state, I think we stopped at Massachusetts. So I'll be doing Missouri next. But that question for Massachusetts about the driver's license, like even when I read it on the show, people were confused. Like people in the chat were like, so do we vote yes or no? Like, yeah, I think the wording is very important. And then the other thing too, I think that people have to understand is this all goes back to corporate money. And so one of the things that we have talked about, myself and Roger and with Betsy as well, is it possible in Massachusetts to run a BI to get corporate money out of electoral politics, at least on the local level? And do you think that would be successful?
Yeah, what's heartbreaking, I don't want to give another downer, but because the Supreme Court, obviously the federal Supreme Court, has ruled that money is free speech, that you can't limit how much money can be spent, including with the disastrous 2010 Citizens United decision, you could not at the state or local level, limit or regulate. You can regulate a little in terms of reporting, but you can't limit corporate money going into a ballot campaign. And so that literally means Bank of America could spend $50 million if the public bank referendum was up in Massachusetts. They could spend an unlimited amount of money because, very disappointingly, the majority of our Supreme Court has said that money is free speech, and therefore, even though someone who's a multi-billionaire has infinitely more power and political power than someone, you know, who's working or middle class, they concluded that somehow money was the same as free speech and therefore protected under the First Amendment.
Where does have you heard from Elizabeth Warren about this? Where does she stand on these two bills? Just curious.
Yeah, we have reached out to Senator Warren about the public bank bill because an issue that she has championed at the national level, which is sort of similar, is actually to establish banking in post offices. So, you know, the post office, obviously, a sort of public institution, that is something that she has championed. So it's a little different from a purely public bank, but we are reaching out to her to get her support. She's been, you know, I think a national leader on, you know, taxation issues, on corporate power issues. So we hope to get her support as well as, you know, the entire congressional delegation. But really right now it's reaching out to individual state legislators. The bill will go to the Financial Services Committee. We have a Senate chair, Senator Paul Feeney, who is a great labor leader, great progressive Democrat on a lot of economic issues. So I've talked to him already about the bill, and I know that he was supportive of the bill last session.
Okay, here's a question I think that's really good because this one has come up before too from Mastermind Hour. Find a local credit union. So in reference to credit unions and a public bank, do you feel a credit union would be better than the regular private banks like Bank of America? Probably so. But when you compare the two, what would you say is the difference between like the credit union and a public bank?
Yeah, and credit unions, you know, do provide generally a better service to their customers, which tend to be, you know, industry or community specific. So I have found that credit unions are generally providing, you know, a more community minded, you know, service and more community minded lending to a community or area than the private banks. However, you know, a credit union still has the same profit motive. They still, you know, unfortunately are not filling the gaps that we found in those areas that you highlighted earlier. So, you know, there's still disproportionate lack of credit unions and banks in poor communities. There's still a lot of communities that would like to get, you know, loans for infrastructure projects, and unfortunately, again, the proof is in the pudding. Is that, you know, those loans are not being provided to communities or individuals or entrepreneurs, and that's why we need this public bank to fill those gaps.
Do you know where Mayor Wu stands on these two issues? Because I know she's been, or she has put forth a new affordable housing plan, although I have criticisms there too, because I feel like when I look at some of the affordable housing listed on boston.gov website, I don't feel like $4,000 a month is affordable. I don't feel like that's affordable at all. And then she's also started a reparations task force. So she seems to be a little bit at least open to hearing these issues. Have you heard from her on where she feels about these two pieces of legislation?
I have not on those on these two bills. I mean, Mayor Wu is doing fighting the good fight on so many fronts, including the recent rent control proposal, which, you know, would have to be approved by the legislature, even for Boston. So we'll certainly do our outreach, but I do think at the end of the day, it's about reaching out, you know, across the state to your state rep and state senator. You know, without significant support from legislators, even to have sort of progressive leaders like a Mayor Wu or Senator Warren will only go so far. You know, we saw that with the driver's license bill. We saw that with the millionaire's tax, is that it really was a sort of union-led, you know, led by a lot of leaders of color, a lot of immigrants on those issues, convincing their legislators to support those bills. So I go back to the fact that it's tough work, but that organizing needs to happen in every single legislative district, and that's our approach as the session has begun.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely wanted to mention her because I know she's been trying to do I guess I would say she's been trying to do measures that were not tried under Mayor Walsh or Mayor Menino. So it seems like she's trying to do
Yes.
some things in that area. So I think I wanted to make sure like if she does not know about these things, because I want to try to talk to her as well to get her eye on these, because I think that she does have a strong voice and I think she could help in a sense, so to speak. But I think that the other issue I was going to mention to you in reference to Massachusetts, especially starting with the pandemic, there's been an influx of people leaving Eastern Massachusetts. For those who don't know, that's the Boston area, and moving towards Western Mass, especially those who are trying to buy a home. And if that continues, then what you're going to see happen is gentrification is going to be taking place in Western Massachusetts, because it's like you pick up from one place and you just go to another place and then the same thing happens. This has been happening all across the country. What do you think should be done in reference to the housing issue that we have in the state, especially the Boston area? It's just really expensive. And do you feel that something like affordable housing is going far enough? Because I think I've lived here for a little over 11 years now, and I've just continued to watch the rent just increase.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, housing is such a massive task, and so much of it is influenced by the market and where people want to live, which I think for a variety of reasons, perhaps most significantly because there's so much job growth in Eastern Mass, that's why you have so many people continuing to move to Eastern Mass, though there is the Globe reported an exodus of a relatively small amount of people leaving because of the housing prices. But the reality is, when there's a new housing development, whether in my district, which is Metro West / Central Mass, or closer to Boston, Somerville, or Cambridge, those units are filling up, generally by people that are quite well off. And so we really need to address the housing crisis. I think it is a multi-pronged approach. I am the Senate sponsor of the local option rent control bill. So I do think we need to get the rent increases under control for communities that want to have that pass locally, like Boston or Cambridge or Somerville. I think that public housing plays a really critical role for low-income residents. We need to provide more state and federal funding to public housing. Look, the reality is there's a lot of people that might not have the savings to buy a home, but obviously everyone deserves a safe place to live, and I think public housing provides a real place for that. And then I think the what's just begun to be implemented is this housing choice / transit-oriented housing, where the communities can approve denser housing developments, more apartments. There's requirements on housing being placed near, MBTA train stations or commuter rail stops. So that's an area where I think we could make a dent. But, and this is in some ways where the public bank could come in, is that, you made the point about, the looking at these listings of affordable housing and they're, $3,000 or $4,000 a month. How is that affordable? Is that's really an area where, I think a public bank and just more state, support, is that you've got to make sure that there's the restrictions, that there's the commitment to how do we get rental housing that's, $900 a month, $1,000 a month? How do we get the houses that are $200,000 to $300,000 to buy for a family? Because if housing that's affordable is $500,000 to buy, if it's, $2,500 a month to rent, that's not affordable to most working families. And it's an incredible frustration. I think the public bank could make a difference. I think just generally deeper subsidies, including, more vouchers like Section 8 or MRVP, but it's really a multi-pronged approach. Our Governor Healy, has made it a top issue. She's going to appoint, hopefully by this summer, a housing secretary, but I do think we need an aggressive legislative agenda of all the things I talked about to really make a dent in the housing crisis in Massachusetts.
Agreed. Bizarro Joe said gentrification already ramping up here in Worcester, Sabby. Yeah, so the last time I was in Worcester, I noticed a big difference. It again, it's
Mhm.
that's what I was saying. Like they people pick up and they just move to another city, and it just spreads and it continues. One more question for you, Jamie, in
Mhm.
reference to home ownership, because I've seen some other states kind of do programs for people who may be, I don't know if I want to say working class, but they make under a certain income. They've
Mhm.
implemented programs to help them be able to get a path to home ownership. Do you foresee something like that, or has anyone put forth any type of legislation in the state house for that in Massachusetts, so that people that live in some of these neighborhoods like Roxbury and JP, et cetera, that they have a path to home ownership and they're not forever renters?
Great question, and we did use, and I give former Governor Baker credit on this, is that the advocates went to our previous governor Charlie Baker and said, there's a distinct decrease or lack of home ownership, specifically in the Black community, and he put a lot of money into a lot of different housing agencies to increase that, and it did increase. So I really give him credit for that. That was a lot of the ARPA dollars, which is, as far as we can tell, have mostly been spent. And so, this gets back to, you need a dedicated source of revenue. I filed a bill called the HERO Act, Housing Environment Revenue Opportunities Act. And it would, through a deeds excise fee, when people buy their house, it would raise about $300 million. Half of that would be for climate resiliency in communities. Half it would be for affordable housing, and it could be for homeownership opportunities. So we have a real richness of CDCs, community development corporations, throughout Massachusetts that are creating these homeownership opportunities for housing that's $250,000, $300,000, that often is accessible for working families. So there's the sort of institutions there, there's the programs, but there does need to be greater funding. And my fear is, with ARPA money, mostly gone, with the pandemic money having been spent, is unless we have a dedicated revenue source, that those programs will start to get cut, and the progress we made over the past 2 years will be reversed.
That's right. That's what very well said, Jamie. I think people really need to understand that those pandemic funds they only go so far. So
Mhm.
when it's gone, it's like you still you need to find a way to replace that revenue. Um, in reference to the housing thing, the pandemic I think helped me out a lot because the interest rates decreased dramatically, and I was like, this is
Mhm.
it. This is my moment. This
Right,
is my
right.
moment. So that's how that helped me get on the path to home ownership. But I think if it wasn't for the pandemic, like right now, I think I would still be in my apartment in Somerville. I really do.
Mhm.
Like I don't know how I would have been able to, at that point in time. But I lied, Jamie. One more question.
Oh,
Are
that's
you
okay.
are you familiar with the crisis that happened in Libby, Montana, in reference to how they obtained Medicare for all?
I am not. No, and that's a city in Montana, or?
Hmm.
I am not. I would, we're looking for examples of success, because I will say the Medicare for All movement has had a tough couple of years. Appreciate the work of President Biden, but he very clearly does not support Medicare for All, and I think it's been difficult even for progressives in Congress to move the bill forward.
That's right. So Libby, Montana, they actually had an asbestos issue in the mines. And so it affected,
Mm.
this isn't a big town, but it affected the people in the community. So they were actually able to plead to President Obama at the time that we need to give everyone in Libby, Montana health care because they were exposed to the asbestos here from the mines. Actually, people in East Palestine, Ohio could do the same thing right now. I don't know if they know this, but they could do the same thing and say, we were exposed to the chemicals from the train derailment. They could do that too. So technically, if you go back to the pandemic, the start of the pandemic or the height of the pandemic, technically every state in this country could make that same plea for universal health care because of they were exposed to the
Mhm.
virus and how it affected the state and the economy and health insurance for them.
That's a great argument, and I'll be honest. I'm frustrated that more people that went through the pandemic that had negative health outcomes, obviously tragic losses to their families. I wish there were more voices, from those individuals and families speaking out in support of single payer, because I think that would be a very powerful argument to make progress on Medicare for all in Massachusetts and across the country.
Agreed. Well, Jamie, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Sabrina, thanks so much for having me on. Appreciate your work and always glad to come on. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.